Hi, guys. My name is Don Jones. Welcome to By Chance or By God, the only channel for skeptics with an open mind. This story is a little different than what we've done in the past. It's a little longer than our other stories, and it takes place during the Civil War, so that's also a change of time frame. And your job, as always, is to tell me, what do you think? Did this happen by chance or by God? This is lesson number 9, and it's titled A Lesson in Forgiveness. It was taken from a book called Great Stories Remembered, and this particular story was written by T. Morris Longstreth, Longstreth. The Ripley brothers were as different in nearly every way as the rapids and still pools of a mountain stream. Perhaps that is why they loved each other in a way not usually meant for brotherly love. Will Ripley was the still pool. He was thoughtful to the point of appearing drowsy, honest as daylight, mild-tempered, and 20. On July 7, 1863, he was up north in Pennsylvania somewhere, either alive or dead, for as you can read in the dispatches of the time, the terrible Battle of Gettysburg was just over. The Ripleys, on their farm near Washington, had not heard from him for some time. Although Will was not a soldier at heart, he had responded to Lincoln's call for more men 2 years before, leaving his younger brother Dan at home to help his father and mother. Dan was now 14, a high-strung, impetuous, outspoken lad of quick actions and hasty decisions. He was the laughing rapid, but for all his hastiness, he had a head and a heart that could be appealed to, usually. The only thing to which he could not reconcile himself was the separation from Will. Even Will's weekly letters, which had seldom missed coming until recently, and which always sent messages of love to Dan, coupled with encouragement to stay on the farm as the best way to aid the cause, scarcely kept him from running away and hunting up his brother. Dan knew that he and his collie Jack were needed to look after the sheep. He knew that his father, who was little more than an invalid, must have help. But to see the soldiers marching set him wild to be off with them. In fact, Jack seemed to be the anchor that held him. Dan sometimes even thought that he loved Jack next to Will. The summer of '63 had been unbearably hot. There had been an increasing, ominous list of military disasters. Even the loyal were beginning to murmur against Lincoln's management of the war. Then Will's letters had ceased, and Mr. Ripley could get no answers from headquarters. Dan was irritable with fatigue and his secret worry. His family was sick with the heat and tension. The climate to this state came from an unforeseen event. Jack, crazed either by the heat or by some secret taste for blood, ran amuck one night, stampeded the sheep, and did grievous damage. Farmer Ripley doubtless acted on what he considered the most merciful course by having Jack done away and buried before Dan got back from an errand to the city. But to Dan it seemed, in the first agony of his broken heart, an unforgivable thing. Weariness, worry, and now this sharp-knife woe changed the boy into a heart-sick being who flung himself on the fresh mound behind the barn and stayed there the whole day, despite the entreaties of his mother and the commands of his father. That evening his mother carried some food out to him. He did not touch it. He would not talk to her. Some time later, as the night wore on, he stole into the house, tied up some clothes into a bundle, took the food at hand, and crept out of his home. Once more he went to the grave of his slain pal. What he said there, aloud but quietly, need not be told. Sufficient it is to know that a burning resentment toward his father filled him, coupled with a sickening longing to be with his brother Will. Ill with his hasty anger, he thought that Will was the only one in the world who loved or understood him. In the wee hours of the morning he left the farm forever, as he thought, and turned down the road that led to the soldier's home not far away, where he hoped to find someone who could tell him how to get to Will's regiment. The sultry, starless heat of a Washington midsummer enclosed him. The wood was dark and breathless. His head throbbed, but he pushed on, high-tempered, unforgiving. He would show them all. Suddenly, he remembered that he had not said the Lord's Prayer that night. Dan had been reared strictly. He tried saying it walking, but that seemed sacrilegious. He knelt in the dark and tried, but when he got to, "As we forgive our debtors," he stopped, for he was an honest lad. The new gulf of mental distress was too much for him. It brought tears. There in the dark by the roadside, Dan lay and bitterly cried himself into an exhausted sleep. At the same hour, another worn person, a tall, lean-faced man with eyes full of unspeakable sorrow, was pacing the chamber of the White House in the nearby city. The rebellion had reached its flood tide at Gettysburg 3 days before. The president had stayed the flood, bearing in tireless sympathy the weight of countless responsibilities. Now, all day long, decisions of affairs had been borne down upon him. Decisions that concerned not only armies, but races, not only races, but principles of human welfare. He was grief-stricken still from his son Willie's death, and his secretary in the room downstairs, listening unconsciously to the steady march of steps overhead, read into them the pulse beats of human progress. Lincoln had given instructions that no one was to interrupt him. He was having one of his great heart battles. Finally, shortly before dawn, the footsteps stopped. The secretary's door opened, and the gaunt gray face looked in. "Stoddard, do you want anything more from me tonight?" The secretary arose. "I want you in bed, sir. Mrs. Lincoln should not have gone away. You are not fair with her or us." "Don't reproach me, Stoddard," said Lincoln kindly. "It had to be settled, and with God's help it has been. Now I can sleep, but I must have a breath of air first." "There's nothing?" "Only the matter of these deserters, sir, and that can wait." The president passed his hands over his deep-lined face. "Only," he murmured, "only. How wicked this war is. It leads us to consider lives by the dozen, by the bale, wholesale. How many in this batch, Stoddard?" The secretary turned some papers. 24, sir. You remember the interview with General Scanlon yesterday." Lincoln hesitated, saying, 24. Yes, I remember. Scanlon said that lenience to the few was injustice to the many. He is right, too. Lincoln held out his hand for the papers, then drew it back and looked up at Stoddard. "I can't decide," he said in a low voice. "Not now. Stoddard, you see a weak man. But I want to thresh this out a little longer. I must walk. These cases are killing me. I must get out." "Let me call an attendant, Mr. Lincoln." "They're all asleep. No, I'll take my chances with God. If anybody wants to kill me, he will do it. You must go to bed, Stoddard." The two men, each concerned for the other, shook hands good night, and Lincoln slipped out into the dark, his long legs bearing him rapidly northward. During the heat, he usually slept at the soldiers' home, being escorted thither by cavalry with sabers drawn. But he hated the noise of it, and during Mrs. Lincoln's absence was playing truant to her rules. When he neared the home, he felt slightly refreshed and turned into a wood road. The sky to his right began to lighten. By the time dawn showed the ruts in the road, Lincoln realized that he was tired. Abe, he said half aloud, "they tell me you used to be great at splitting rails, and now a 5-mile stroll before breakfast. Well, what have we here?" The exclamation was occasioned by his nearly stepping on a lone youngster lying in the road. The boy raised his head from the small bundle of clothes. The tall man stooped with tenderness, saying, "Hello, Sonny. So you got old Mother Earth to make your bed for you. How's the mattress?" Dan sat up and rubbed his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I appear to be waking you and making a bad job of it," said Lincoln. "You didn't come to take me, then," exclaimed Dan, greatly relieved. "I wouldn't have gone," he added defiantly. Lincoln looked at him sharply, his interest aroused by the trace of tears in the boy's eyes and the bravado in his voice. "There's a misunderstanding here," said Lincoln. "Almost as bad a misunderstanding as Mamie and her mother had over Mr. Riggs, who was the undertaker back home." Here the gaunt man gave a preliminary chuckle. "Ever hear that story, Sonny?" Dan shook his head, wondering how such a homely man could sound so likable. Lincoln seated himself on a fallen tree trunk. "Well, it was this way," and he told the story. Dan's quick, impetuous laugh might have disturbed the early rising birds. Lincoln joined in. For an instant, Dan completely forgot dead Jack and his deserted home. For the same fleeting instant, Lincoln forgot his troubles in Dan's laugh. The boy chuckled again. "I'll have to tell that to Fa—" Then he didn't finish the word, remembering with a pang that he was not going to see his father again. Lincoln caught the swift change on his face, and it was his turn to wonder. He knew better than to ask questions. You can't fish for a boy's heart with question marks, neat little fish hooks though they may be, so he said, "Our sitting here when we ought to be getting back home reminds me of another story." "Tell me," said Dan, well won already to this man despite the gray-lined cheeks and the sadness that colored his voice. Dan didn't know yet who he was. He had not seen the cartoons that flooded the country during the election. He was too young to go in alone to the inauguration, and the idea of the President of the United States sitting with him in the woods was too preposterous to cross his mind. When Dan had laughed heartily over the second story, Lincoln said, "Well, Sonny, I reckon we ought to be moving, don't you?" He helped the lad with his bundle. "Are you going to the war too?" asked Dan. "I am." "You?" exclaimed Lincoln. "Why, you're no bigger than my own tadpole, and he's only a wriggler yet. Does your father know?" "I reckon he does by now," said the boy darkly. "Father's an early riser, you see. He killed my dog without my knowing, and so I left without his knowing." The hardness of the boy's voice hurt Lincoln, who said, "What's your father's name, Sonny?" "William Ripley, that is, Senior. Will, that's Junior, my brother, is off at the war. I'm Dan. I'm going to find my brother. I don't care if I never come back. I love Jack better than—" His voice choked. Lincoln put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He was getting the situation. "Jack was your dog?" asked the big man as gently as a mother. "Yeah. And father shouldn't have killed him, unbeknownst to me. I'll never forgive him that. Never." "Quite right," said the wise man, walking with him. "Don't you ever forgive him, Dan, or don't ever forget it, under one condition." "What's that?" asked the boy, a trifle puzzled at the unexpected compliance of his elder with his own unforgiving mood. "Why, that you also never forgive all the kind things that your father has done for you. Why did he kill the dog, Dan?" "Well, he killed some sheep," said the boy. He would be honest with this tall, gentle, and grave person who understood so readily. "How old are you, Dan?" 14, going on 15. "That's quite a heap," said Lincoln musingly. "Quite a heap. In 14 years, a father can pile up a lot of good deeds. But I suppose he's done a lot of mean ones that can cancel him off, has he?" "No," admitted Dan. His frankness pleased the president. "I congratulate you, Dan. You're honest. I want to be honest with you and tell you a story that isn't funny, for we'll both be in the same boat as I size up this proposition. Yes, both in the same boat. I'm in the Army in a way. At least I'm called Commander-in-Chief, and occasionally they let me meddle a little in things." "Honest?" said Dan, opening his eyes wide. He has been so absorbed with his own disasters that he accepted this strange, friendly acquaintance without question. But now, although the forefront of his consciousness was active with the conversation, the misty background was trying to compare this man with a certain picture in the big family album with another one pasted in the dining room cupboard door. The same loose-hung person, only this one had a living rawness. Maybe it was bigness about him that the picture didn't give, like a tree, perhaps. But it couldn't be the president talking to him, Dan. If it was, what would the folks at home? And again this thought stopped. There would be no more folks at home for him. Honestly, Dan, but sometimes they don't like it when I do meddle. There's a case on now. Last night I pretty near had 24 men shot. Whew. But I hadn't quite decided, and that's the reason I came out here in God's own woods. And I'm glad I came, for you helped me decide. I have? Said Don, astonished. To shoot them? No, not to. You showed me the case in a new light. Here you are, deserting home, deserting your father, bringing sorrow to him and your mother, who have sorrowed enough with Will and Danger and all. You're punishing your father because he did one deed that he couldn't very well help, just as if he'd been a mean man all his life. And it's like that with my 24 deserters, Dan, very much like that. They've served faithfully for years, so how can one thing they do be so gross, so enormously bad as to blot out all the rest, including probably a lifetime of decent living? I think not. Is a man to blame for having a pair of legs that play coward once? I think not, Dan. I tell you what I'll do, Sonny. The tall man stopped in the road, a new light shining in his cavernous, sad eyes. I'll make a bargain with you. If you go home and forgive your father, I'll go home and forgive my 24 deserters. Is that a bargain? The boy had been shaken, but it was difficult to change all at once. It's hard to forgive, he said. Someday you'll find it hard not to, said the great man, putting out his huge palm for the boy to shake. Isn't that a pretty good bargain, Dan? By going home, by ceasing to be a deserter yourself, you will save the lives of 24 men. Won't that be merciful? God will remember and perhaps forgive you some trespass sometime, even as you forgive now. Something of last night's horror, when he could not say that prayer, and something of the melting gentleness of the new friend before him, touched the boy. He took Lincoln's hand, saying, "All right, that's a go." "Yes, a go home," Lincoln smiled. "I suppose I'll have to turn now." "Where's your home?" asked the boy, knowing yet wishing to hear the truth, to be sure, for now he could tell the folks at home. "The White House," replied Lincoln, "but I wish I were going back to the farm with you." The boy heard him vaguely, his jaw sagging. "Then you are the president?" Lincoln nodded, enjoying the boy's wonder. "And your servant, don't forget," added Lincoln. "You have been a help to me in a hard hour, Dan. Generals or no generals, I'll spare those men. Any time I can do anything for you, drop in now that you know where to find me." The boy was speechless with his assured elation. "But you'd better—" "Wait." Lincoln began hunting through his pockets. "You better let me give you a latchkey. The man at the door is a stubborn fellow, for the folks will bother him. Here." And finding a card and a stub of a pencil, he wrote, "Please admit Daniel Ripley on demand. A. Lincoln." "How's that?" "Thank you," said Dan proudly. "I reckon I should have guessed it was you, but those stories you told kind of put me off." "That's sometimes why I tell them," Lincoln smiled again. "It's not a bad morning's work. 24 lives saved before breakfast, Dan. You and I ought to be able to eat a comfortable meal. Goodbye, Sonny." And so they parted. The man strode back the way he had come. The boy stood looking, and then swiftly wheeled and sped. He had been talking to the president, to Abraham Lincoln, and hearing such talk as he never had heard before, but especially the words, "You have been a help to me in a hard hour, Dan." Those words trod a regular path to his brain. Dan ran, eager to get to the very home he had been so eager to leave. Forgiveness was in his heart, but chiefly there was a warm pride. He had been praised by Abraham Lincoln. Of this day he would talk to the end of his days. Dan did not know that the major part of the day, the greatest of his life, was still to come. Certainly the dawning of it had been beautiful. Breathless and with eyes bright in anticipation of telling his tale, he leaped the fences, ran up to the back door, and plunged into the house. The kitchen was quiet. A misgiving ran over him. Were they all out in search of him? Would he have to postpone his triumph? In the dining room, a half-eaten meal was cooling. He explored on. and coming out to the spacious front of the house, he found them in an inexplicable group around a uniformed officer, tears streaming down his mother's cheeks. His father, still pale from his accident, looked ashen and shriveled. They turned at Dan's approach. He expected that this scene of anguish would turn to smiles upon his arrival. He was amazed to find that his return gave them the merest flurry of relief and alleviated their sorrow not at all. "Danny, dear, where have you been?" asked his mother. "The Lord must have sent you home in an answer to our prayer," said his father. Then they turned back to the officer, pleading, both talking at once, weeping. Dan felt hurt. Did his return, his forgiveness, mean so little to them? He might as well have gone on. Then he caught the officer's words. "Colonel Scott can do no more, madam. The president cannot see him, and more pardons are not to be hoped for." Mrs. Ripley turned and threw her arm across Dan's shoulder. Danny, you are our only son now. Will was..." She broke down completely. "Will was found asleep while on duty, Dan," his father said grimly. "And is he to be shot?" asked the boy. "I wonder if he was one of the 24. They looked at him, not understanding. "The Lord has restored you to us. If we could only pray in sufficient faith, he could restore Will," said Father Ripley devoutly. "Dear, let us go in and pray. We should release this gentleman to his duty. We can talk to the Father about it." Dan realized with a sudden clearness that his brother, his beloved, was to be taken from him as Jack had been taken. It shook his brain dizzy for a moment, but he knew that he must hold on to his wits, must think. There was Abraham Lincoln, his friend. "You pray," he cried to his father shrilly, "and I'll run." "Run where, dear? Will is in Pennsylvania." "To the White House, Mother," he said. "Any time I can do anything for you, drop in." "Anything, Mother. Surely he will." "Who?" cried both his parents. "Why, the president, Mr. Lincoln." "But the president is busy, dear." "He'll see me. I know he will," said Dan. "Look, we have a secret together, the president and I." And the boy showed the card and poured out his story. The mother saw a break in her gray heaven, saw a bright blue of hope. "We must go at once," she said. "Father, you are not able to come with us, but pray here for us." "Please take my horse and carriage," said the officer. "Yes," said Dan, "let's hurry." "Oh, I'm so glad," and the joy of his luck turning back shone in his face as he helped his mother into the vehicle. "May God help you," said the officer. "He does," said the boy. In the high noon, when the doorkeeper of the White House, hardened into a stony guard by a daily onslaught of Lincoln seekers, saw an impetuous youth leap from a light carriage and help a woman up the portico steps toward him. "In what room is the president?" asked Dan. "He's very busy," said the doorkeeper, "probably for the 500th time that morning. Have you an appointment?" "No, but he said I should drop in when I wanted to, and what's more, here's my latchkey." Dan, trembling a little with haste and pride, showed him the card A. Lincoln had written. The man looked quizzically at it and at him. "In that case," he said dryly, "you'd better step into the waiting room here." There must have been 40 or 50 people crowded into that anteroom, each on some urgent errand. Some were in uniform, all looked tired, impatient, important. Dan saw the situation and knew that Lincoln could never see them all. He whispered to his mother and showed her to a chair. Then he went up to the doorboy and asked if the president was in the next room. The boy admitted the fact, but would not admit anything further. The annoyed looks on the faces of the waiting people deepened. "Does this urchin," said their looks, "expect to see the president today, when so many more important persons, such as we, are kept waiting?" Dan, not caring for etiquette when his brother might be shot at any moment, slipped under the arm of the doorboy and bolted into the room. Lincoln was standing by the window. He looked around in surprise at the noise of Dan Ripley's entrance. He recognized his walking partner made a motion for the doorboy, who had one irate hand on Dan, to withdraw, and said, "Why, Dan, I'm glad to see you so soon again. You were just in time to back me up. Let me introduce you to General Scanlon." Dan looked into the amazed and angry eyes of a Union general who, practically ignoring the boy, went on to say, "Mr. President, I repeat that unless these men are made an example of, the Army itself may be in danger. Mercy to these 24 means cruelty to nearly 1,000,000. The President, worn not only from his sleepless night, but from the incessant strain of things, looked grave, for the general spoke truth. He turned to Dan. "Did you go home, Sonny?" Dan nodded. "Then I shall keep my half of the bargain. General, this boy and I each walked the woods half the night carrying similar troubles, trying to decide whether it is best to forgive. We decided that it was best, as the Bible says, even 70 times 7. Dan, how did your folks take it?" Dan spoke quickly. "I would have killed them if I'd run off for good, for they just got word that my brother Will, I told you about him, is to be shot for sleeping on watch. I just know he was tired out. He didn't go to sleep on purpose. I told my mother that you wouldn't let him be shot if you knew." Lincoln groaned audibly and turned away to the window for a moment. The general snorted. "I brought my mother in to see you too," said Dan, seeing as she wouldn't quite believe what I said about our agreement. Lincoln looked at the boy, and his sunken eyes glistened. "I agreed for 24 lives," he said, but I don't mind throwing in an extra one for you, Dan." And this time the general groaned. "Stoddard," added the president, "will you see if there's a Will Ripley on file?" The secretary left the room. Lincoln turned abruptly to the general. "You have heard me," he said. "I, with the help of God and this boy, threshed out the matter to a conclusion, and we only waste time to discuss it further. If I pardon these deserters, it surely becomes a better investment for the United States than if I had them shot. 24 live fighters in the ranks instead of that many corpses underground. There are too many weeping widows now. Don't ask me to add to that number, for I won't do it." It was rarely that Lincoln was so stirred. There was a strange silence. Then the secretary entered with, "Yes, sir. A Will Ripley is to be executed tomorrow for sleeping on duty. The case was buried in the files. It should have been brought to you earlier." "Better for the case to be buried than the boy," said the president. "Give me the paper, Stoddard." "Then you will," said Dan, trembling with joy. "I don't believe that shooting the boy will do him any good," said Lincoln, as the pen traced the letters of his name beneath the message. "Will Ripley is not to be shot until further orders from me." Dan looked at it. "Oh, thank you," he said. "Can I bring Mother in to see it and to see you?" he asked. The president looked down into the shining face and could not refuse. In a moment, Dan's mother was in the room. She was all confused. The general was red with irritation. She read the message. It didn't seem quite clear to her. "Is that a pardon? Does that mean he won't be shot at all?" "My dear madam," replied Lincoln kindly, "evidently you are not acquainted with me. If your son never looks on death till orders come from me to shoot him, he will live to be a great deal older than anyone else." She stretched out both her hands, crying, "I want to thank you, sir. Oh, thank you, thank you." "Thank Dan here," said Lincoln. "If he had not let the warmth of forgiveness soften his heart, Will Ripley would have died. And perhaps if I had not met him in the woods at dawn, I might have gone into eternity with the blood of these 24 men on my hands. Dan helped me. True, they are erring soldiers, Mrs. Ripley, but we must consider what they have done and what they will do as intently as we discover the wrong of the moment. Goodbye, Dan. We will both remember today with easy consciences." The waiting crowd in the anteroom could not understand, of course, why that intruder of a boy who had fairly dragged the woman in to see the president so unceremoniously should bring her out on his arm with such conscious pride. They could not understand why the tears rolling down her cheeks at the same time that a smile glorified her face. They did not see that the boy was walking on air, on light, but the dullest of them could see that he was radiant with a great happiness. If they could have looked past him and pierced the door of the inner room with their wondering glances, they would have seen a reflection of Dan's joy still shining on the somber, deep-lined face of the man who had again indulged himself in mercy. Thank you for listening. I know this was a lot longer than a normal podcast. Again, your job is to say, do you think this all happened by chance or by God?